This is Marcos Patchett, the nocturnal herbalist, and in this video I'm going to be talking about ways to treat cancer, and specifically a model for the holistic treatment of cancer that's addressing it on every level, from the level of symptoms and symptomatic level all the way down to the level of sustaining factors and causes. Now, disclaimer before I get into the video, I'm not suggesting that this model in any way means you can neglect conventional treatment or conventional medicine. In fact, this model is, and also I'm not suggesting this model guarantees success, but I hope you'll see as the video goes on that it stands to reason and that it is a model which should enhance any chances of successfully defeating cancer or getting the best prognosis. And also it's a model that can be used by anyone, by conventional oncologists or by complementary practitioners. So yeah, anyway, that's my position. So hopefully you'll see what I mean. I'm just going to go into a bit of medieval medicine. And this was a list of things that the medievals called the 6 non-natural things. Now, just before I get into this, I want to ride a little hobby horse for a couple of minutes. In writing about medieval medicine and ancient medicine in general, modern authors have a tendency to kind of diss it and assume that all our ancestors were stupid and ignorant because they didn't know some things that we now know, like germ theory, or they didn't have antibiotics, or they used to do bleeding and stuff like that. They weren't idiots. There are some remarkably complex and interesting herbal formulae from the Middle Ages, and certainly from the Arabic physicians, and also from the Roman era. And some of them were quite sophisticated, and I think would certainly bear further investigation. And yeah, the idea that they all just used to, you know, bleed people or make people puke and whatever all the time just for any disease, I think that was a later development. I think that was a later Enlightenment thing, like just as the Enlightenment was happening and people were starting to develop new chemical drugs. At that sort of turning point, at that transfer point between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, physicians were still using huge doses of the new chemical drugs, like the minerals like antimony and mercury, but they were giving them in similar doses to the old plant drugs and basically killing people. Likewise, the old rationale for bleeding people, which would only have been done in certain states, like if an old Roman Galenic physician or a medieval physician had diagnosed a patient with a condition of excess blood, they would have bled them. But in the transfer stages, sort of like 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, a lot of physicians were just bleeding people for everything, because the old humoral empirical rationale that was attached to humoral theory, which was based on observation and a whole corpus of belief and practice, that had been kind of abandoned. So a lot of our ideas about the sort of unsubtlety of that medicine are based on the worst aspects of its practice and on stereotypes. It's not to say that they didn't do stupid things, they did, but then I suspect that in 500 years' time, people will look back at a lot of the stuff that we're doing now and say that that was also really bad and really wrong, and how could they have been so stupid? So it's best not to assume that people were stupid. Some of their medicine was actually really interesting and useful. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of documentaries even make that assumption. It's really prejudiced, actually. Prejudice meaning prejudging. All right, so, but the 6 non-naturals is a really useful list that medieval physicians used to employ. It's a sort of checklist of things to try and get back to normal so the person returns to health. And it's useful here. The first one I would put in the middle bracket of my little pyramid model in terms of the symptomatic, and the remaining 5 will go into the foundation layer, adjusting the long-term lifestyle sort of elements that will help to bring the person back to health and to maintain good health. So the first one is retention and evacuation, which really means excretion, like going to the toilet basically, but also it would have meant things like sweating and coughing, nosebleeds even. But in terms of modern practice, we can look at particularly bowel habit and stuff like that. So there are lots of plants that can adjust this, that can adjust the function of the liver or the kidneys, and so diuretics, for example, the liver, you've got things which can enhance phase 1 and 2 liver metabolism, which can protect liver cells. So protect liver cells, you've got stuff like silymarin, the complex of compounds from milk thistle. You've got phase 1, phase 2 inducing plants such as Schisandra or Wuweizi from the Chinese medicine corpus, and so on. There's lots of plants that can help with that elimination of rubbish that might be contributing to symptoms and may even be contributing to disease progression. But one of the things that modern research is focusing on is the microbiome, the little microbes in the gut. So you know, that's important because the state of your flora in the gut is a stress indicator. It's affected by and affects in turn the immune and hormonal status of a person, and it also has a big effect on inflammation, and inflammation is a risk factor for cancer development and progression. So if you can modify the state of the gut, that would be useful, and really we'd be looking at plants or herbs to affect that. So that'd be a medicinal thing, and of course different therapists would have different ways of bringing that about and modifying those factors. The remaining 5 fit into the foundation layer of the treatment model. So number 2 would be sleep, and what we're looking at here would be circadian rhythm is a huge factor. So not only the amount of sleep that you get, but when you're sleeping. So this is extremely important, because if you are sleeping during the day and awake at night, you are going to be completely out of kilter with a natural rhythm. And this matters because it's found that while cortisol, the stress steroid, tends to rise in a 24-hour cycle, whether or not it's, you know, you're in artificial light or daylight, melatonin, which helps you sleep, is strongly influenced by blue light, and there's a lot of research about this now. You've probably heard about it. Blue light meaning the kind of sunlight and artificial light from screens, from phones, from fluorescent lighting, from all of that, and blue light suppresses melatonin. The effect of that is not only to make you less sleepy, but also to slightly suppress specific immunity, or more accurately to modify it. And the kind of immunity it tends to decrease is immune response to cancer cells and viruses and intracellular pathogens generally, but cancer cells specifically. So it seems to me no accident, or at least at the very least a curious coincidence, that the population explosion of cancer, and I'll refer to this in future videos as well, do some more detail on this. The population explosion of cancer has paralleled in many ways the spread of artificial light, the appearance of light pollution, and the sort of 24-hour sort of light culture, I guess. The fact that we no longer have a dimming or a reduction of blue light after sunset as we used to do, so our hormones are all screwed up by it. So what can be done there? Kind of obvious stuff. Try to normalise the sleep cycle, better sleep hygiene, and use sort of screen filters and stuff like that at night. Even like do what I do like a crazy person and use candle light at night. So after 8 p.m. I have a curfew where I'll put a filter on my phone, or a filter on my computer if I'm still using it, the red light filter, the blue light filter rather, to remove the blue light, and just switch over to candle light, because actually it helps me get ready for bed. It makes me feel more tired, and I really like it. That's a bit extreme for some of you, particularly if you've got kids, because, you know, on balance, it's probably better that your house doesn't burn down, but you get the idea. There are things you can do to sort of regulate your sleep cycle and reduce your exposure to blue light at night. And that's particularly important, of course, if you already have cancer. It might be described as shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted, but these long-term foundational adaptations is what will not only bolster and support any treatment that you're undertaking, but will make it more likely that they will go for the long run, that you won't have a relapse, or whatever they call it, whatever the term is. I've put a link in the description box below this YouTube video about this, a few links actually. Poor circadian rhythm, i.e. a mashed up sleep cycle, significantly increases cancer risk, and oncogenesis, the appearance of cancer cells, is linked to circadian rhythm disruption. The remedies I've talked about: sleep hygiene and light hygiene, having a bedroom that's quiet and dark, not having artificial light in your bedroom. So, that may mean you have to put sort of, better curtains or some kind of screen in front of the window if you're right in front of a street light. Consistent bedtimes, getting up at the right time, setting alarms. I even set an alarm to remind me, not just to get up, but to remind me to finish work and to eat dinner and start getting ready for bed, because otherwise I have the kind of brain that will just keep working, and in fact I will very easily blow past my bedtime if I don't remind myself you need to start winding down now. And I found that very helpful as well. So daylight exposure is really helpful. So actually getting out into proper natural blue light during the day is helpful, so that your brain gets a shot of the thing at the time when it's supposed to be getting it. That improves your vitamin D production, which itself helps your immunity, but it will also help in the evening when that blue light is reduced. It'll help the natural melatonin production begin, and it'll help you to wind down. There's another interesting paper, I'll put in the link below the YouTube video, in the description box, about chronotype. That means the type of sleep cycle people have. Some people are morning people, some people are evening people. I'm an evening person. It turns out that may be unfortunate, because they found in this one study, at least, women with breast cancer, that people who identified as night owls were more likely to develop breast cancer, and that may be for the reasons I've already talked about. So this doesn't mean that you have to change who you are. If your brain is more awake in the evening, you can still do some work in the evening, but I would suggest try to match your patterns more closely to a natural daylight rhythm. And of course, if you live somewhere with extreme daylight night conditions, like in the Arctic Circle or whatever, where you have like 2 hours of daylight and whatever, then just try and map it to sort of 8 hours of light and activity, and then start dimming the lights either side of it, so you get a good sort of, in winter, maybe a sort of 14 plus hour dark cycle, and in summer maybe a 6 to 8 hour dark cycle, something like that, if possible. May not be possible, capitalist economy, 24 hour, whatever, but we all have to get up and work and do stuff. But as far as practicable, that's something to bear in mind. So sleep, we've talked about, quality of sleep. I'll come back to that in a minute. The third thing is exercise and rest. So appropriate exercise that's appropriate to one's ability, one's age, and one's fitness level. It's not good to go and run a marathon if you haven't trained and you're, 10 stone overweight and you've not done any exercise for 10 years. Probably kill you. So just start where you're at and work up. And if somebody does have cancer, in terms of treatment, you can implement gentle exercise that is tolerable, depending how weak they are, etc. It's not good to make somebody who cannot stand up or barely raise their arm do exercise. That may be exercise enough, but if somebody's relatively fit, then some exercise will be beneficial. So I've put a link again in the description box below the YouTube video about Qigong and Tai Chi. and the benefits in cancer. There's a meta-analysis, that means a group analysis looking at 18 different trials and collating all the data, found significant positive effects on fatigue reduction and depression with Tai Chi and Qigong. And Qigong showed particularly better hand grip strength and balance, and increased 6-minute walking test performance. So this is in elderly and debilitated cancer patients, for older adults particularly, as compared to usual care in a daily walk. So just adding those Tai Chi and Qigong exercises improved their performance and their manual strength, as well as reducing their fatigue and improving their mood. So that's all good stuff. And of course, there's lots of evidence showing that being more sedentary, having less exercise, increases your cancer risk. And again, I've put a study there below the YouTube video in the description box on YouTube. Okay, number 4, diet. So that's the general approach here, and I'm going to do a whole separate video on diet at some point because this is a huge topic, but just generally speaking, you want to do 2 things: reduce carcinogens and cancer promoters in the diet, and increase cancer fighting stuff in the diet. Basically, that's it. So carcinogens are substances or things which actively encourage or cause cancer cell production. They cause ordinary cells to turn into cancer cells. So these can be things like aflatoxins, which are fungal toxins found in contaminated peanuts and cereals, things that have gone a bit mouldy. You've got stuff like the nitrosamines, which are typically found in preserved red meat, but also found in fermented cheese, pizza, some grains, seafood and beer. I know, it's really depressing, isn't it? But they're found in those foods. Heterocyclic aromatic amines, particularly found in red meat, particularly sort of like char-grilled red meat. And I can't read that. I've just put, I think that's refined, but it's my usual drunken doctor writing. Sorry about it. I'm not a doctor, but I do write like one. Anyway, so the point there is just in general, you want to reduce all of those actual carcinogens in food. So red meat, particularly smoked or preserved meats, unfortunately have to cut those out. Foods that might have a high aflatoxin content, so anything that's moldy would be a good idea. Cheese is probably a good idea to cut out. Those are the main ones, I guess, but also I mentioned, cheese might be a good idea to omit that. Potentially seafood, maybe. But that's the actively carcinogenic foods. Cancer promoting food is a much broader thing. Now, these are foods that may not contain actual carcinogens, but might, as a result of their sort of secondary metabolism over time, encourage or enhance the growth of cancer cells. So those would be foods with a high content of refined sugar, white sugar. Why? Maybe because of its effect on the microbiome, causing the proliferation of less desirable, more inflammatory microbes, and maybe also because it enhances insulin resistance. In other words, you get elevated insulin response when you eat lots of sugar, and over time that gets less and less effective, so you start getting higher blood sugar, and that can cause all sorts of problems, including an increased risk of cancer. Processed foods in general, just because they contain more additives and gubbins that are likely to make you more inflamed, or certainly, and they often omit useful nutrients. And particularly excess dietary protein. We eat in general far too much protein. Now, a high protein diet might be useful to some degree, arguably, for some bodybuilders, although that's disputable. Even bodybuilders don't need as much protein as they seem to think. But for growing, like for teenagers and stuff, it may not be such a problem, but for adults, excess protein is not good. And I've put a link showing that, or giving some of the arguments as to why, in the description box below the YouTube video. One hypothesis is that protein elevates the levels of a hormone called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which enhances cell growth generally fine if you're an adult. It'll enhance the growth of rapidly growing cells. What's the most rapidly growing cell of all? The cancer cell. So probably not good to have an excess of that. So a slightly lower protein intake. So highly protein dense foods would include stuff like certainly meats, animal products, fish, meat particularly, but because of the carcinogen content. Fish also contains some carcinogens sometimes, and cheese to some extent, but basically high protein foods aren't so great to have in excess. So you want to cut those out. You want to definitely cut out the carcinogenic foods, and you want to reduce those high protein foods, remove any refined sugar from the diet, I would suggest, if possible, and also remove any processed food if possible. And you want to increase foods with anti-cancer nutrients. So broadly speaking, that will be coloured fruits and vegetables. That means the ones with pigments in them, either dark green leafy veg or fruits which are red or yellow or purple. Stuff in the cabbage family, stuff in the onion family, edible things, turmeric and ginger, these are all great things. Compounds such as the polyphenols, allicin, or other sulfur compounds that you find in the allium family, in the garlic and onion family, the polyphenols and derivatives like the flavonols that are in all those pigmented fruits and vegetables, cabbage family compounds that like particularly sulforaphane, which has been well researched, and the curcuminoids in turmeric and in ginger. All of these are very well researched. There are others such as what do you call it in green tea? EGCG, epigallocatechin gallate in green tea is excellent. But all these compounds added to the diet. So you want to enhance, basically, it's dark green leafies, fruit and veg, particularly pigmented ones like purple ones, red ones, things with funky colours in them, just as a rule of thumb. And also omega-3 fatty acids are good. Now these, of course, we know you get from fish, but I've mentioned that fish can actually be a source of carcinogens as well. So a bit of good quality wild caught oily fish would be good. Having said that, of course, our oceans are subject to overfishing, and in 10 years time will apparently be mostly plastic. So I would advocate an algae based omega-3 supplement, or you can get some omega-3s from plant-based sources such as raw uncooked walnuts or flax seeds. Flax seeds are actually great. I'll talk about them in another video. But anyway, diet. Reduce the carcinogens, or remove them, and up the anti-carcinogens, generally speaking. Item number 5 is, traditionally it was air, the quality of air to the medievals, but this really generalises to the environment we inhabit. So things which can cause problems would be mould, pollution, the light-dark cycle in the environment I've already talked about, but mould, black mould, stuff like that, known source of black mould, Aspergillus, is somewhat carcinogenic, and aflatoxins I mentioned in peanuts. Well, I'll pop a study in the description box below YouTube, on YouTube, about inhaled aflatoxins from people working in feedlots and with grain and stuff like that. The job can often be a source of exposure to these things. So there are obvious things like working with asbestos, but then if you work with things like chemical hair dyes or with particular paints and stuff like that, really look into it, because if you have any exposure to these things, you absolutely want to eradicate that exposure from your life. And the last thing I would talk about is perturbations of the mind. Lovely phrase. And of course this means things like anxiety, depression and mental health. I will go into this more in a future video, but suffice to say, if you have a cancer diagnosis, it's a good idea to get some psychotherapeutic support and some help working through any repressed emotional issues that you've got. There's conventional psychotherapy. I love hypnotherapy myself. I think that's a great thing to go for, because you really want to fast track any access to any buried stuff that you've got. And psychotherapy is fantastic, but you may not have 20 years to dig this stuff out. So it would be great to do some fast track work as well. So hypnotherapy can be great for that. And there's a school by, she's very on vogue at the moment. I'm not talking about the pop group, Marissa Peer. I'll put a link to her website below. Now the thing is, her stuff, her rapid transformational therapy, I really enjoy watching her talks and I love listening to her speak. I'm not aware that it's had any form of scientific validation or testing, but I instinctively like her, and I think I love her spin on things, and I like the way she delivers stuff. So I would encourage you to at least have a look at that. I also do astrology, which has sod all in the way of scientific verification. Has, you know, there's a little bit, but basically, you know, to me, if something has practical, empirical utility, I'm more concerned about the effect it has on me or on a client than I am about its validation, particularly if it's not going to do any harm. So something like her methodology, which mixes a bit of basic psychology, basic psychotherapeutic technique with if psychotherapy can ever be described as basic, but psychotherapeutic technique with hypnotherapy, I really like that combination, because it's sort of, as the name implies, it's supposed to be rapidly transformational. And she claims to have helped people get rid of eating disorders, for example, within 2 or 3 sessions, which is phenomenal. I'd love to see more validation, you know, statistics and stuff on that, but whatever, I like her. So I'll put the link to her stuff below. Thank you if you've watched all the way through. This was a very, very long one. I do appreciate it, and hopefully see you in the next one. Okay, bye.